So it seems that the final Grotmas detachment is now revealed to us. Let's talk about some Space Wolf fighting infantry, and how the champions of Fenris stack up in game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where it seems that it's the last day in the Grotmas Advent calendar, so Games Workshop's final rules drop in Warhammer 40k in this rather mammoth update to the game. Over the last 24 days we've had 40k rules content every single day, a new detachment for each faction, and they're all fully playable in the core match play rules and will be available in the app in January. Yesterday we had World Eaters, but the Christmas Eve detachment seems to be the day for the Space Wolves, and Games Workshop did confirm that there'd be no Grotmas detachment on Christmas Day itself, but something rather better. I think most people are pretty keen to see some new 40k miniature reveals, most people expecting Emperor's Children, probably the revelation of some Noise Marines at least, maybe an entire launch box for the faction, or even Demon Primarch Fulgrim if we're super lucky. I suspect I'll be able to find some time to talk about that on the day, though it might be a bit of a brief video. It's usually good fun in any case, always nice to have some cool miniatures to take a look at, along with all the rest of the Christmas festivities. For the last day's rules though, the Space Wolves maybe feel kind of appropriate to leave till last, pretty much the most wintry themed of all the 40k armies. It seems for the Sons of Fenris, Games Workshop have decided to give them a sort of infantry and maybe vaguely Terminator themed formation. The idea behind these guys is that it's veteran infantry fighting it with Valor as if their Primarch was watching and judging their worth, which feels like a pretty core Space Wolf trope. They're probably best known for their infantry in general, though there are a few Terminator locked rules, and it won't support their mounted units like their Thunderwolf cavalry like the Champions of Rust detachment does. I'm not sure if they're necessarily needed to also name this one a Champions detachment, feels like that might just add to confusion a little bit. Who knows though, maybe when we get the Space Wolves Codex they're all going to be champions of something. In any case, for this detachment, their core rule is the Great Wolf Watchers, and it basically feels like a return of their old-style heroic intervention style rules, which they got a boosted version of back in 9th edition. The core rule is that if at the end of the enemy charge phase there's a unit within 3 inches of one of your infantry and walker units that can charge, then you can basically charge those units for free, and you do so similar style to heroic intervention, rolling your charge distance, though under normal circumstances you never normally fail that, even if you rolled a double 1. You can't do it if they wouldn't normally be able to charge, so say if they were in engagement range with something else, and they don't get their charge bonus when they're charging in, so they don't get fights first, which does mean that the enemy could be striking before you. Kind of interesting to see a return of basically 9th edition heroic intervention, which they did used to have army-wide and could threaten at 6 inches if they needed. In practice though, this one's usually just going to be an area denial tool as opposed to actually triggering all that much, unless your opponent just forgets about it and moves things in range, in which case it has the potential to be a bit of a gotcha moment, maybe a little bit feels bad for the opponent if they just forgot about the rule and moved to trigger it. It is somewhat useful. It means that you can't go too close to any Space Wolf units without being ready to wind up in melee with them, and a lot of shooting units that might want to walk onto mid-board objectives and steal those points wouldn't be able to. That feels like the single biggest impact of that rule, being able to deny the mid-board to your opponents. If you had a Space Wolf unit sat on the middle of an objective, then your opponent might not be able to tow onto the objective point without triggering the rule in their charge phase. It doesn't affect everything though, so mounted units aren't included, so this one's not for the Thunderwolves. And in addition to that, there's also a +1 objective control for Terminators as well when they're not battle shocked. So I guess OC2 Terminators, giving them a little bit more weight on the points they're trying to fight over. I think that is a helpful enough buff for Terminators, to be honest. They tend to be one of the tankier Space Marine units out there, so compared with some of the other ones, there's a bit more chance they do actually wind up living on an objective and having to try and claim it against the opponent's objective control, and OC2 could actually tip the balance. As detachment rules go, it's not nothing, but it is competing against the very powerful detachment rule of the buffed Champions of Rust, basically starting with army-wide Feel No Pain as a really simple and easy one to add to your power, or going for lethal hits or sustained hits if that makes more sense, with a chance to unlock more with your character units achieving certain big deeds, which potentially can add up to some pretty spectacular army-wide buffs by the end of the game if you do get a good run and your opponent allows you to trigger those other sagas. I feel like the danger with this detachment rule though is that if your opponent just doesn't forget about it and do something stupid, it's basically never going to trigger. It's not really going to do too much against melee units, given that they can charge somewhere outside of 3 inches, and it might not even always deny the mid-board objectives. Say if your unit can't get to within the centre of that objective and just has to tow on, you still might not be able to use this. As detachment rules go, I just don't think it's really that strong. Before we move on to stratagems and things, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in the Primal Hounds upgrades, a whole bunch of 3D printed bits made by Great High Studio that could be good for adding a bit of Space Viking theme to otherwise blander Primaris miniatures out there. The physical bits and parts are sold by Only Games, with a ton of different bits offerings on sale, and currently have a Christmas sale for 30% off everything over the next 2 days, so some unusually good deals on themed things. They've got a couple of core bits packs, but also a massive amount of things around the sort of £7 or $10 kind of mark, basically all the things that you might expect to be able to upgrade on a miniature. Say for example a bunch of heads here, nice Guard Space Viking heads, and a few Norse or Asgardian looking helms. A bunch of backpacks with things like shields and axes slung across them, or drinking horns. And most of those come in the big core set, along with a ton of shoulder pads and loincloths and things. There's loads more though, tons of weapon bits packs like these two-handed weapons or these shields here, which I think look rather fun. Options for things like jetpacks and wolf capes. And perhaps one of the most spectacular things is this ancient armour, which I saw someone had painted up in a very snazzy way on Reddit. In any case, feel free to check them out, there'll be links down in the video description below, and thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Moving on to the stratagems for these champions of Fenris though. First up we have one of the best ones called Prey Taker's Eye. This one's a nice flexible infantry damage dealer one. Your infantry squad can either gain sustained hits or lethal hits when they're either shooting or fighting. Really flexible just to be able to plug in one command point for extra damage on any infantry unit there. Particularly lethal hits against anything that you'd be wounding on a 5+ or worse is probably the biggest deal here. Things like Blade Guard, Power Fists or Wolfen might really enjoy that one in particular. In any case though, definitely helps you double down on the infantry theme of the detachment. We've got Armour of Contempt here as well of course, worse than the AP of the attacks of just one enemy unit now. Still powerful, though tends to be a bit more so against just one big shooting enemy unit, or against one unit that you might be happening to fight in the fight phase. Next up, for one command point, we've got Chilling Howl. This one's a kind of interesting Terminator objective shenanigan type one, and you use it in the opponent's command phase, and then every enemy unit within 6 inches needs to take a battle shock test with -1 to the test if the unit's below half strength. The idea behind this one, I guess, will be that you charge your Terminators in, you're scrapping over the mid-board objectives, and then hopefully have them in range of a single unit that's claiming an objective and force them to test some battle shock. If there's a leadership 7 units that have a 42% chance to fail, and that could be a very direct way to steal a bunch of victory points that your opponent was about to score. You also wouldn't be able to auto-pass this as well, as it happens in the more general command phase as opposed to the battle shock section. Unfortunately, like most battle shock things, it's just really quite unreliable. Your opponent could just easily pass that test, and it's less useful versus leadership 6 armies, plus maybe a little bit on the situational side being locked to Terminators, unless you happen to be fielding loads of them in this. Occasionally it could be really annoying for your opponent, but most of the time it's either not going to be an option, or it's just not going to do anything even when triggered. Next up, for one command point, we've got Stalking Wolves. This one gives you stealth for an infantry unit when your opponent's just selected them as a target. That's another helpful option for a reactive durability stratagem, and this one will last for the entire phase, unlike Armour of Contempt. Feels like it could be nice for any infantry squad in the open about to get focused by a bunch of things. Given the theme of the detachment, maybe a Terminator squad. Those Space Marines have got plenty of other scary infantry now. Stealth tends to be an okay durability buff, tending to be better against things that hit on a 4+ or weren't relying on lethal hits or sustained hits to do a chunk of their damage. It's not absolutely game changing, but I guess it's nice enough to have. Next up, we've got more objective things with Runes of Claiming for one command point. This one's one of the sticky objective rules, this one put down by an infantry or walker unit at the end of your command phase, and that objective marker will then remain yours until your opponent manages to claim it for them at the end of any phase. Definitely a nice helpful mission support one for a close game. It means that if your infantry unit gets gunned down at a far, then it'll still be yours. If the objective is perfectly contested with even OC, it'll still be yours, or you could potentially move on to the next fight and leave that point on its own if your opponent can't move on to it. In the right situation, this one's definitely useful. Finally, for one command point, we've got Onrushing Storm, and this one's a Terminator redeploy style one, allowing a Terminator unit to return to strategic reserves at the end of the opponent's fight phase. You can't do it within engagement range as per normal, and for some reason it seems to be locked only to the standard Terminator squad as opposed to the Terminator keyword in general. I don't know if that's mainly just to prevent you using it on, say, lone characters to bounce around the board and score things, but it also looks like you wouldn't be able to use it on Assault Terminators, and you wouldn't be able to use it on Wolfguard Terminators, which seems like a curious decision. I guess in theory, for a walking Terminator squad that's slogging its way up the board, you could use this to get a turn 1 deep strike if the enemy goes first, have them on the board and be ready to move up and countercharge if they push up too early, and if they don't, then use this to redeploy and deep strike them. That does basically mean to committing to walking Terminators on foot up the board though, which doesn't really feel like it's usually the best idea. They do get more support in this detachment than others, but maybe not anything that feels like it's really adding loads to their damage or defense. Finally, we get into enhancements, and first up we have the Wolf's Wisdom for 30 points. This one's infantry only, and it grants you a 6-inch charging the enemy turn ability rather than the 3-inch that the detachment rule gives you. To me, this one feels really quite a pricey one for having to commit to it pre-game. It does genuinely boost the area denial though, so I guess maybe you could have a unit that's holed up in ruins and still stopping the enemy from coming within really quite a long range of them. Perhaps could be nice with something like a Judas here and a bunch of Blade Guard or something, being able to threaten just to walk into combat and then fights first anyway. It does feel really quite expensive though. Next up for 15 points there's Foe's Fate. This one's Terminator only, and enemies falling back must take desperate escape tests. Vehicles and monsters don't have to, and if the enemy's already battle shocked, then they're -1 to that test. It feels not unhelpful. You could potentially charge something with a Terminator unit, destroy it, and then consolidate into something else to make some tests. But I feel like if you're just taking the regular desperate escape tests, you'll only lose a third of a unit, and your opponent can command point reroll if one casualty was critical or something. For 15 points, it doesn't really seem auto-include or anything. Next up, for 15 points, we've got the Fang Rune Pendant. This one allows a Terminator unit to fall back, shoot and charge. I feel like that one seems handy enough to be able to do that, get a bunch of firepower off and charge somewhere different, potentially meaning that they can preserve fights first as well. That one seems fine added utility for 15 points, though won't come up every game. Finally, for 20 points, we've got Longstrider. This one allows you to re-roll charge rolls. That one's not terrible, particularly if you're trying to make charges out of Deep Strike, which tend to be a bit unreliable in the first place, and to get you to a 48% chance to be able to do that, and not have to spend a command point for the privilege. It doesn't seem auto-include though, and you could weigh up the extra spend versus just spending a command point if it happened to be needed. It still doesn't exactly make charges out of Deep Strike super likely. Overall, for value out of this one, I feel like the core rule does add a bit of area denial. The infantry damage dealer stratagem is useful enough, as is the stealth infantry and return to reserve terminators. Presuming you do actually commit to standard on the board terminator squads though, which is a bit questionable perhaps. It does have a couple of objective support things, and the enhancements seem fine, though not really standout. I would say again though that this one probably doesn't compete very well with the core index detachment right now. I can't really see many people actually choosing to use this over Champions of Rus if doing well in competitive games is what you're after. Getting a good feel no pain or damage buff right from the start feels like it's stronger than quite a lot of what this detachment offers to start with, and if you can do one of the sagas in the game, then that only gets bigger. It's also got some nice melee support stratagems such as extra AP, potentially advance and charge with one of the sagas, and boosted consolidations and things. Plus in this one, the support options being locked to infantry and terminators is just a little bit on the weaker side, as opposed to a detachment rule that helps out everything, including the Thunderwolves if you want to run them. Unfortunately for the Champions of Fenris, it does feel like it's a fairly weak detachment currently. I'd say the core rule not being impactful enough is probably the biggest deal. Maybe if that was a 6-inch range, it might be a little bit more tempting. It just doesn't really feel like it does much aside from stopping people outscoring with a weak unit on primary objectives, presuming you're right in the middle of that primary objective, or doing the occasional slightly unpleasant gotcha moment if your opponent forgets about it. In any case though, let me know what you make of the Space Wolves detachment. Would you be tempted to try this out, or is it just a bit too underwhelming? Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments below. As mentioned, feel free to check out the Primal Hounds link down in the video description if you want to find some cool alternatives for various different Space Viking style bits. As mentioned, their Christmas Day sale will be going on for the next couple of days as well, with 30% off all their parts. Otherwise, I'll leave that there for this one. Looks like this is the end of the Grotmas detachments. I might try and do a bit of a tier list roundup of them in the not too distant future though. I'll leave the link to the full video playlist down in the video description if you want to check out one for any given faction. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the 40k videos coming. Certainly interested to see what we get on Christmas Day. Otherwise, check out all the other bits down below, things like the channel's Patreon page or the affiliate discount links for Warhammer, all the ways to support the channel and keep the videos coming if you'd like to. In any case though, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.